Okay, I would say go ahead, Bailey.
Great. Can everyone hear me okay? Awesome. Okay, so thank you and welcome to the first AOS Monday Colloquium of spring term. We've got a really solid turnout today for Dr. Merritt Tretzky. So a little bit of an introduction for her. Dr. Merritt Tretzky is a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Colorado Boulder. Her research centers around plant ecology, biogeochemistry, and global change, with an eye towards carbon dynamics in northern ecosystems. She obtained her bachelor's from Villanova and a PhD from the University of Alberta. She uses a variety of approaches, from large-scale manipulations in really awesome-looking field sites in Alaska and Canada, to laboratory experiments and paleo-ecological reconstructions to understand the resilience of communities and ecosystems to environmental change. She looks at important issues such as permafrost degradation and shifting wildfire regimes, as well as drawing connections to environmental policy. Dr. Turetsky is a founding member of the Permafrost Carbon Network and serves as the director of INSTAR, the Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research at UC Boulder. Additionally, Merritt is very engaged in outreach and science communication and was named a AAAS Science Engagement Fellow in 2018 for her work creating a science segment for a morning show on a Canadian television network. Excited to hear from you today.
That's great. Thanks. And, it's great to join you all virtually and maybe soon, the movement will be a lot easier and we can do this in person. Before I share my screen, I do want to mention that I'm speaking to you from Boulder. We do sit on the ancestral lands of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. And, here at INSTAR, though we have Arctic and Alpine in our name, we are very much focused on issues, particularly water rights that affect some of the contemporary tribes that continue to live in our neck of the woods here in Colorado. But I'm going to be speaking not really about Colorado issues today, more so about my work in northern regions. I tend to focus on, work in the interior Alaska and Northwest Territories of Western Canada regions. These lands are known as Chief Dry Grass Territory, the Yellowknives Dene First Nations, and I will have a little bit of a chance at the end of my talk to mention how we're shifting some of our work away from traditional carbon cycle science into, work that addresses community needs. And sometimes those very much overlap with carbon and water usage, but they also address issues like food and access to lands and fishing holes. And so I hope to have a chance to talk about that a little bit today. And all of this land acknowledgement is, meant in the context of both truth and reconciliation with our northern community partners. So with that, I am going to share my screen and get us going. There we go. So I am very happy to field questions as we move along. Definitely let me know if you've got a point of clarification or if you want me to slow down. And maybe Bailey, you could have an eye on the chat function for me, since I am just in general really bad at monitoring things like that. Today, I actually want to talk about two disturbance regimes that I've been fascinated by for a long time, and that includes permafrost degradation, which I'll spend most of my talk addressing today. But towards the end, I do want to talk about the interplay between sort of frozen ground and ground conditions and wildfire regimes. And fire is on everybody's mind here in Colorado and in the Boulder territory right now. But I've been thinking about boreal and taiga or subarctic fires for almost my whole career. So I want to talk about some of the interactions between these disturbance regimes and an issue that fascinates me as someone who is a contemporary ecologist, but got her start in paleoclimatology. And that concept is the concept of legacies. How much contemporary change, whether it's climatology, whether it's ecological change, whether it's hydrologic change, how much contemporary change is dictated by the past, by the memory that is held in sediments or soil or water or any component of our Earth system. This question really fascinates me. I am a peatland lover, and peat is a biological and physical legacy. So material legacies are often what we think about in northern ecosystems. It's cold, sometimes it's wet. And so we do get this material building up over time that can then influence how ecosystems and communities respond to contemporary change. But that's just one type of legacies. I'm also going to be addressing some informational legacies due to thousands and thousands of years of repeated cycles of wildfire followed by very classic successional cycles. That's another kind of legacy through these sort of passed down informational cycles that very much is part and parcel of how northern ecosystems have functioned. And the question is, as the climate continues to warm and as human disturbance continues to become more of a threat to northern ecosystems, how long will these legacies hang on? And are we in fact already starting to see an erosion of some of these legacies that have just been so integral to how northern ecosystems function? So that is very much on my mind as we move through the talk today. Let me start by talking about a classic material legacy. You can't get more classic than this. So permafrost is frozen ground. This is a Russian word meaning perennial frost. And permafrost is a subsurface phenomenon. It underlays the majority of Canada, about 60% of Canada. It underlays about 80 to 90% of Alaska. But you may not know whether you're walking on top of permafrost or not, because it is buried underneath a layer of vegetation and moss and peat and soil. Sometimes that layer, which we call the active layer, is 20 centimeters thick. Sometimes it's more than a meter thick, but that active layer freezes and thaws seasonally through the year. But if you dig through that active layer with your hands, with your shovel, with your soil core of choice, you ultimately will hit permafrost in these permafrost ecosystems where the ground is perennially frozen. But not all permafrost is created the same. So permafrost is any earth material that remains frozen for consecutive years. But it can be a variety of material. It can be frozen sand, frozen rock, frozen peat, which is the best kind of permafrost in my opinion. And often it's earth material mixed in with these pockets of ground ice. And so that's what I'm trying to show in that block cut out on the right, just a very heterogeneous block of earth material where kind of the lighter swirly gray areas are these areas of frozen ice. And that is going to be a big theme in my talk today, because ice-rich permafrost is a very unique kind of permafrost that yields unique expressions on the landscape when it thaws. Permafrost is in itself a layer. It often is sitting on top of these bulbs of unfrozen material that we call talics. Those talics can take on different shapes. So here in brown, you can see sort of a deep talic, but then there's sort of brown talics actually mixed into the permafrost. And these can be really important areas where biological material and water can flow in and between permafrost patches. So permafrost is some pretty cool stuff, and it is a diverse medium in itself. These are just a couple of different ways or snapshots of how to think about permafrost. So on the top, we have a map of Alaska with that beautiful Aleutian Island chain. And really, let's start at the top of Alaska on the north slope. We're in a continuous permafrost zone. It's very, very cold. Permafrost is found everywhere on the landscape. And as you move down the Alaska Highway, traveling down through the mountain range towards Fairbanks, we move into that discontinuous permafrost zone where permafrost is sometimes present. It's sometimes present in low, flat peatlands and wetlands. It's present on colder north-facing slopes. But in sunnier, high albedo areas, it's too warm. We may not find permafrost in those south-facing slopes, for example. And as you keep driving south through this beautiful transect, permafrost transect of Alaska, we eventually move into sporadic and isolated permafrost regions. This is actually the type of permafrost I first started to study as a graduate student. And this is true ecosystem protected permafrost found almost exclusively in peatlands where really thick peat layers protect the permafrost. So we have two types of material legacies, peat and permafrost, working in concert with one another to affect how ecosystems form. This cartoon or the schematic on the bottom is just sort of a lateral cross section of what our permafrost tour might look like. Again, moving from northern Alaska down through the discontinuous permafrost zone in the center of our schematic near Fairbanks and even further south. So in the far north, where it's cold and we're on the north slope, that permafrost is old, it's found everywhere, and it's very, very thick. This permafrost is thawing as well, but this permafrost is going to be with us for a long time, even, despite climate change. Will it change? Of course, but this permafrost is cold permafrost, and it often is just going to be around for a while. As we move further south, again, into that more patchy or discontinuous permafrost zone, this is where permafrost ecology becomes a thing. So we have patches of permafrost in that darker gray color that are separated from one another by areas of unfrozen soil or unfrozen water. And all of that water is mixing in and between permafrost blobs. There's really fascinating energy and nutrient transfer between those permafrost patches. And this is like an ecologist's dream. We have a pretty thick layer of unfrozen peat and moss and litter at the surface of these permafrost blobs that are probably working to keep the ground cold and protect that permafrost. So we don't call this climatically driven permafrost like in the North Slope. We call this ecosystem driven or ecosystem protected permafrost. You lose that ecosystem at the surface and you can create some of these feedbacks in which all of the resilience mechanisms keeping that ground frozen start to unravel and unwind very quickly, and we can see rapid rates of permafrost degradation. So again, permafrost is fascinating. It is a very diverse medium, not just in age, thickness, occurrence, but also because of how it interacts with unfrozen material and because it is this diverse Earth system media. And so here's the crux of the permafrost issue. Permafrost is a thermal state. It's frozen material. And we have a long history in science, starting in Russia, but also in Alaska and in Canada, of measuring permafrost for decades. Some of the earliest measurements go back 100 years. They're all of temperature. So we've been monitoring the thermal state of permafrost very well for a long time. And those records need to continue. And those records have been instrumental in telling us that permafrost is changing, not just in one region, but around the world. But the problem is that temperature is not the only reason why permafrost matters to us. We're missing some of the most fundamental aspects of permafrost change if we don't also consider the issues or the permafrost characteristics that drive ground subsidence and ground destabilization, which is partly temperature, but it's how temperature interacts with ground ice. That's a more difficult issue to study. We're very limited in our data sets on ground ice. We care about permafrost feedbacks to climate as that permafrost organic matter thaws and decomposes. That is not a temperature issue alone. It's how temperature is interacting with carbon. Again, now we're starting to measure ice and carbon in permafrost in tandem with temperature, but these are much more difficult variables to study, and we're behind on some of these additional bubbles in our Venn diagram. But these are the areas where permafrost matters, not only to the global climate community because of feedbacks, but also to local land use and food production through issues like land disturbance and subsidence in ice-rich permafrost. So they're all issues of societal importance. I do want to talk about the permafrost carbon feedback to climate, because I think this helps illustrate two equally interesting but very different types of permafrost thaw or permafrost degradation. And you'll note that I am using the word thaw a lot, and I'm not using the word melt. I don't get super anal about the public using the term permafrost melt, but soil can't melt. Soil can thaw. A frozen turkey in your freezer can thaw. These issues don't melt. So just like a frozen turkey or just like a hunk of frozen soil, permafrost thaws, it does not melt. And I just mentioned that because that kind of flares up every once in a while on social media as a debate. And I think, people who use the term permafrost melt are thinking about the ground ice component or some of the water-based components in permafrost. And that's an absolutely fine term to use, but it doesn't really refer to permafrost as that earth system or earth material that we just went through. So the feedback to climate sets up because permafrost for thousands and thousands of years has been locking away remnants of biological activity at the surface of Arctic and subarctic ecosystems, taking that biomass as it's being worked over in surface soils and then locking that organic matter and the carbon and the nitrogen and the phosphorus, all of the other microelements as well in that organic matter away in frozen accumulating layers over time. So I like to refer to permafrost as Earth's oldest and most efficient freezer. There's a range of organic matter ages in permafrost ranging from, deep Pleistocene all the way up to Little Ice Age, which was just a couple of hundred years ago here in North America, aged organic matter. So it's another area where we can define permafrost as a very diverse media because it's a mixture of all of these different aged organic matter structures. So that is all carbon that used to be in the atmosphere that got drawn down through life, microbial, insect, plant, animal, that those organisms died and remains of that biomass became incorporated into permafrost over time. That is carbon that used to be contained in the atmosphere that the atmosphere has not seen anywhere from a few hundred years ago to, again, many, many, many thousands of years ago. But as that soil warms up and it thaws and, microbes are present in permafrost, they're just functioning very slow. But as those temperatures change, those microbial activity can start to respire and, under aerobic conditions, we often see pretty efficient carbon dioxide production as a function of microbial respiration. As that soil possibly becomes wetter and more anaerobic, we can see both CO2 or methane production as a function of microbial activity on thawing organic matter. Previously permafrost, now a legacy of permafrost organic matter. So as that material moves through the climate system in the atmosphere as radiative forcing and potentially starts to play a role in future climate change, this is what we call the permafrost carbon feedback to climate. And this schematic is what many climate models are trying to represent, many large-scale models are trying to represent, where slow, gradual thaw of surface permafrost, where that little squiggly arrows are coming down between organic soil and continuous permafrost. Actually, I have a clicker. Where's my laser here? So as centimeters of surface permafrost thaws over time and triggers this feedback to climate, that is what models are starting to, more efficiently represent in their architecture. And this is absolutely happening. This type of gradual permafrost thaw, again, affecting centimeters of permafrost over decades. This is happening across the circumarctic. So it's a global phenomenon. And we do know something from a handful of large-scale models that do represent this kind of gradual thaw pretty well. We know that permafrost, when it warms up and thaws, does release carbon to the atmosphere, and that carbon can either be released as CO2 or methane. But at the same time, the surface of these permafrost ecosystems are also acquiring new carbon from the atmosphere. So this is plant activity and possibly plant and litter remains being incorporated into surface soils. And so we do need to think about both permafrost carbon release as well as any new carbon being taken up through these sequestration processes. And so we like to think about both. We know that the models so far show that plants are actually a fairly efficient offset to permafrost carbon releases. So that's actually really good news. Plant activity is able to take up enough carbon, in some of these future warming scenarios to offset all or a significant amount of permafrost carbon release, what's coming from deeper in the soil or sediments. But this plant offset starts to diminish over time, and it is extremely threatened by other disturbance regimes, particularly wildfire. And so those are issues that we need to continue to explore within our modeling scenarios. But most models agree that, the more we can limit human emissions, and the more we can rely on climate policies with a heavy mitigation lens, the more we will keep permafrost carbon out of the atmosphere. And that's because we have a greater chance of keeping some of our permafrost frozen into the future, but we can also keep Arctic plants productive. So keep them free of drought, keep them away from wildfire as long as possible, keep them productive. So these are all some modeling results related to gradual permafrost thaw, which is not the type of permafrost thaw that I work on. So the places that I work, which tend to be wetlands and peatlands, sometimes peatlands are forested and don't look a lot like wetlands, although we do classify them as wetlands, but these are low, sort of flat muskeg areas, pretty high water content in the soils. There's not a lot of gradual change happening in these ecosystems right now. And that is because when these systems have permafrost, that permafrost tends to be rich in ground ice. And I'm going to show you a couple pictures of what that looks like. And where ice-rich permafrost thaws, we don't see centimeters of surface permafrost thaw over decades. We can see 3 or 4 meters of thaw occurring in weeks to months, maybe a year. So we're defining this type of permafrost thaw as abrupt thaw or rapid thaw. And this often wraps up a bunch of different processes: thermokarst, thermal erosion. These are sort of more technical terms of permafrost change, but they're united in that they are all happening very quickly. And again, I'll walk you through some photos of what this looks like. So here are 2 very different perspectives on what ground ice rich permafrost can look like. On the left is a photo of one of my favorite permafrost coring partners. This is Jamie Hollingsworth. He is the site manager of the Bonanza Creek LTR, and we do a lot of permafrost coring together. He's actually holding a mineral permafrost core. You can see the gray material at the bottom, but at the surface of this core section is a very beautiful, about 20 centimeter segment of pure ice. And we just happen to core into an ice lens. And we often see this when we're coring permafrost, where you see these alternating layers of just pure ice, and then, bands of either peat, organic rich permafrost or more mineral permafrost. And you can just sometimes look right through these ice lenses. It's just a spectacular find. A very different perspective, not from the surface coring down, but actually kind of walking through these ice lenses. And it's very rare to be able to see something like this. This is in the Fox Permafrost Tunnel, which is a research facility managed, I guess, co-managed by the Army Corps of Engineers, the Krell office in Fairbanks, as well as the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And you can go on a little bit of a permafrost tour, walking through the tunnel, starting at about 20,000-year-old permafrost. And in just half a kilometer walk, you're back into 300,000-year-old permafrost. So it's just a fascinating place to be. And on the side of the tunnel walls, occasionally are these enormous ice wedges. You know, from someone who usually sees ice wedges like this, coring down one tiny little cross section of it, seeing something like this, it just floors me. I've been through this tunnel probably a handful of times, and my jaw just drops every time I pass by one of these. You can see it goes up into the ceiling of the tunnel. This whole thing is just pure ice. It's unbelievable. So you can imagine our core is just popping down into a very narrow sliver of this, but this, you know, three-dimensional view of an ice lens gives you a sense of just how fascinating water is in these ground ice systems. You know, water tends to find itself and congregate together, and that's what can lead to these massive pockets of ice. So just picture what's going to happen to the surface of an ecosystem when all of this frozen water melts. We see the development of what we call thermokarst collapse features. These tend to be extremely wet. So whether it's a semi-aquatic wetland or an actual pond or lake, sometimes it's just in the eye of the beholder. I tend to see wetlands everywhere. But here on the upper left is a classic forested peat plateau. So the area with black spruce and sort of this pretty dense shrub layer has intact surface permafrost. And where that permafrost has now thawed out has resulted in this extremely wet, you can see all the water in the foreground, thermokarst wetland. And in between is an actively thawing margin that we often refer to as a drunken forest. All the trees are, you know, the root systems are starting to get flooded out. The whole soil system is becoming destabilized. And so all the tree trunks start to tip and tilt pretty wildly. And we can see that tilting of the trees from air photos, from satellite images. And it's often the diagnostic we look for as a sign of active permafrost degradation, drunken forests. So this is actually one of our field sites in the Fairbanks area. On the bottom is just flying over an area of the Northwest Territories. All of these wet spots on the landscape. In the foreground are, you know, thermokarst ponds that are now being filled in by vegetation. And so all of these thermokarst sites are sitting in a bigger medium of discontinuous permafrost. And it looks like they're separate. They look like individual little pockets of water, but they're all actually interconnected underground, and they're exchanging water, nutrients, and energy with one another. It's just a fascinating dynamic landscape. And eventually these pockets of water coalesce with one another, and we actually can lose permafrost in a state change where the whole system can flip to an unfrozen landscape pretty quickly. This is what permafrost thaw often looks like in upland systems. We don't see subsidence and sinking of the ground, but rather rapid movement of sediment and material downslope. All of these surface expressions take frozen organic matter and frozen carbon and all the stuff that's bound with it, and either sinks it into a wet spot or moves it downslope into a wet spot. So we're often taking legacy organic matter from a cold, frozen state and moving it into a wetter environment. So one of the great challenges is that this type of more complicated thaw is not included in any large scale model, nor really is any layer of permafrost complexity. Models are really, really developing rapidly, but this permafrost issue is a three-dimensional issue. It's really difficult to even just to start to think about adding into a large grid cell type model. So that's what we started to try to work on in the Permafrost Carbon Network. This is work I started about 10 years ago, and I just published it recently. So if any of you are sitting on your, what I call unicorn paper, for me, this is be my unicorn paper. We decided to do a first order kind of very simple inventory look at whether abrupt thaw was even worth it to include in large scale models. Is this worth the huge investment in people, computing power, computing architecture to try to represent thermokarst and abrupt thaw? Is it worth it? Is it an important or significant enough topic to invest in that scientific infrastructure? So we took an inventory approach where we started to create successional models of how permafrost thaw leads to different state changes in these systems. So this is one example. A permafrost peatland, when it thaws, can move into these very young or actively changing either wetland or lake states on years to decades. And then over time, those young features of thaw start to stabilize and they turn into something new. They can stabilize as a more terrestrialized wetland, or they can become a drained lake. And there are a number of other ecological outcomes that can happen over time. If the climate is conducive to it, permafrost can actually reform in this system. Unfortunately, more and more, we're seeing that temperatures are just, beyond the envelope to support permafrost reaggradation, but that certainly can happen under the right climatic conditions. So once we had our states in this box model worked out from our knowledge on paleoecology and thinking about, our expert knowledge of these ecosystems, we started to put data behind these arrows. So the arrows represent the rates of change between these states in our box model. And that information we gleaned from change detection studies using remote sensing, but also from paleoecology reconstructions, where you can track the development of these different states over time. So sometimes it was remotely sensed data and sometimes it was radiocarbon-based data, but we were able to, think about the switch from permafrost peatland to these active or modern thaw wetlands. These are happening on the order, certainly on a decadal scale, where some of these other areas are longer term changes on a century scale. So with that kind of information, we can start to then run these modeling scenarios where we invoke a certain thaw rate, and then we watch how the rest of the landscape and all of these different states within our box model play out relative to our prescribed thaw rates. So this is just, showing you how we can track the areas of each of these different boxes in our simulated landscape over time. And so as permafrost thaws and starts to disappear, we see a rise in some of these other ecosystems, sometimes with some very interesting nonlinear behavior. So I'm a permafrost peatland expert. This was where I started, but we created 3 of these submodels for different generalized kinds of abrupt thaw that leads more predominantly to thaw lake development, but also in more hilly or terrain rich, more upland kind of environments where things like gullies or thaw slumps are the dominant expression of thaw. So this was a big group effort of the Permafrost Carbon Network. It was a working group that ran for many, many years. And what we were trying to do is compare our inventory model, our simple box model, to some of the assumptions that Dave McGuire had used in his Permafrost Carbon Network model intercomparison study, which focused exclusively on gradual thaw. And so the question we were trying to ask with this abrupt thaw model is, relative to gradual thaw carbon release scenarios, how important is abrupt thaw? what we were able to conclude with this simple approach is that abrupt thaw is a fine scale process. It's affecting small areas of land, but it is, happening all over the circumarctic. And we were able to make some predictions about how much land would be affected by abrupt thaw, over into 2100, into 2300. So it's affecting relatively small portions of the Arctic compared to gradual thaw, which happens everywhere. But when you tally up our three generalized types of abrupt thaw, the amount of carbon release generated from abrupt thaw is about half that of gradual thaw occurring all the way across the Arctic. And this is including those biomass offsets, and it's trying to also track whether that carbon is being released as CO2 or methane, again, which we obtained from an analysis of the literature. And I should have mentioned that earlier. One of the surprising conclusions from this study, and I guess a lot was surprising to me, but this was sort of the big surprise, was that abrupt thaw is characterized by very high methane to CO2 ratios relative to the other type of permafrost thaw. So abrupt thaw is going to lead to a lot of methane release. And this makes sense. It's, ground ice rich areas, we're creating wetlands, we're creating lake systems, and it leads to these hotspots of methane formation in those young thaw lakes or young wetlands that then start to have lower amounts of methane emission over time. But as long as abrupt thaw features are being formed on the landscape, we are seeing high rates of methane being generated from the landscape. And when you take into account the higher radiative forcing of methane and think about just the impacts on climate forcing, abrupt thaw has a similar climatic effect compared to gradual thaw. So to put it another way, by not accounting for abrupt thaw in our climate models, we're underestimating the permafrost carbon feedback by as much as 100%. So is our abrupt thaw model right? Correct? No, this is a tool. Is it perfect? Hell no. But did we accomplish what we wanted to explore the importance of abrupt thaw in the more general landscape of climate feedbacks? Yes, I think we were. We made very conservative assumptions, as we were building this model. And I think our numbers are kind of a little bit of an oomph to the modeling community to kind of get going on thinking about abrupt thaw. So we're hoping this stimulates more effort in implementing abrupt thaw within some of the large scale models, which I think is a next step that's absolutely needed. So we care about permafrost, again, not just because of carbon and not just because of temperature, but also because of all of the impacts it has to society. And these are just some images that commonly float through the literature, showing different impacts to infrastructure. The image on the right is a parking lot at UAF in Fairbanks that I often use, and it's collapsed because of a really dramatic ice wedge that you can see poking out here. We have coastal destabilization that's leading to relocation of, not just communities themselves, but also all of the cultural legacy that those peoples have relied on for generations. So it's a big impact, not just to the global community through climate feedbacks, but a myriad of local to regional impacts as well. And increasingly, my group is shifting into trying to question our own knowledge paradigms and the way that we do science, and trying to recognize that there are multiple ways of knowing, and there are ways to come together with other ways of knowing to make our research more impactful. And I had the pleasure of working with a wonderful PhD student named Carolyn Gibson. She is now completed and working for the government of British Columbia. And she was trying to sort of center permafrost as a key component of a northern social ecological system. Because permafrost is often buried and hidden, it's not front and center when we think about coupling the social and the ecological parts of northern ecosystems. But our argument was, because this is a foundational part of northern ecosystems, this really needs to be front and center. She was able to partner with a NASA Above study that actually sent Alaskans out with GPS units and got them to take data on hazards that they experienced as they moved through the landscape. And Carolyn was able to take those spatial information on hazards, whether it be tree fall blocking, a trail or wildfire scar. And then we did remote sensing and air photo interpretation to try to understand whether the root cause of that hazard had something to do with permafrost change. And she was able to show that the majority of hazards experienced in a variety of communities on the map here on the left did in fact either directly or indirectly relate to permafrost thaw, even though those community members never mentioned permafrost change in their hazard mapping. We were able to use our diagnostics to indicate that these are co-located with one another. Carolyn also skimmed the literature. She took every permafrost paper that was published in the peer review literature. So this is ignoring the gray literature, which for permafrost is extremely important. So this is a weakness of this study. But of permafrost measurements made in Canada and Northern Alaska over the past 40 years that we were able to tap into using literature review, the majority of communities in our area have no permafrost measurements made within a 75-kilometer radius of them. So there's barely any co-location of our measurements of permafrost with the user range of northern communities. And if we want to center equity and justice within our permafrost measurements, I guess I would argue that co-location of measurements is a pretty darn good place to start. So our community has some big work to do. And this is the start of risk assessment. We want to be able to help northern communities assess exaggerated risks or new risks being posed by changing permafrost. And so her work collectively was able to demonstrate that certain communities are much more at risk of abrupt thaw hazards than others. So we are starting to make steps towards delivering hazard maps and risk assessment maps to northern communities that we hope will be more useful to them in the future. And I usually do this. I talk too long about permafrost, but I hope you liked my permafrost tour because I'm going to skip over wildfire really quickly. I'm just going to make a couple of key points about the interaction between wildfire and permafrost. So this is truly a feedback. A lot of people think about how does wildfire trigger permafrost thaw, and that is very important. But permafrost and wildfire have this dynamic interplay with arrows that work in very complex ways. And so that's something, again, many large-scale models do fire and maybe they do permafrost, but are they able to kind of handle the interplay between those disturbance regimes? These are questions we're starting to ask now. And peat is mixed in there too. I can always throw some peat in there. So whether peat remains post-fire is not only a predictor of whether the ground is going to stay wet and cold and maybe frozen, but it's also a predictor of whether conifer regeneration will happen or whether that ecosystem is likely to shift to a deciduous state. Whether we're going to see increased deciduous cover in boreal and subarctic landscapes over time, that is a function of the soil. That's a peat issue. And we tend to see peat being retained after fire, where fire is moderate to low severity. But when we get these really hot, intense fires, like possibly what we're seeing in Siberia right now, that's where we can often see these ecological shifts. And that is reflected both in the vegetation dynamics, but also in whether permafrost is retained post-fire or not. I'm just going to skip over that slide, but I do want to say that sphagnum moss is also a really important component of northern ecological resilience. So this stuff is often the only fuel that can survive a fire. So what you're looking at on the left, we call sphagnum sheep. They're these big hummocks or, mounds of sphagnum moss. They're not happy. So these are bleached out right now, but they'll actually refragment and start growing. So they'll be able to regenerate. That's the only fuel left in this landscape, at least on the ground cover. And so again, there's such a dynamic interplay between sphagnum moss cover, peat depth, and whether or not that ground is going to stay frozen. And the sphagnum moss is important because it has all of these pores of these hyaline cells that are literally sponges for water. And so oftentimes this is the only wet stuff that can even withstand drought. And so it's a really important component of fire resilience in the north. So I'm often asked, what has surprised you in the past few years? And I don't know. I mean, we sort of knew this slow train wreck was going to happen in the Arctic with, more and more media coverage about Arctic change. But those of us who have been working in the North for a long time, we've been watching this come. We've been seeing the changes in fire regimes. We've been seeing more and more permafrost thaw. So perhaps that's not surprising. What has completely shocked me is what is going on in Siberia. This is 3 or maybe even 4 years, I'm sort of losing track now, of intense heat and fire in places like Eastern Siberia that I mean, I don't work a lot in this area, so maybe I'm speaking out of bounds, but it certainly feels unprecedented. So what we know is that some of the fire activity that is, getting a lot of press attention, this is happening in the world's most sensitive permafrost. This is Yedema Pleistocene aged permafrost. And so Jess McCarty and I were able to kind of do a quick and dirty air photo and remote sensing interpretation of what was actually burning in 2020. And we were seeing all sorts of permafrost features that were actually, you can see the combustion happening in these sites. So we do know that thermokarst, these are old thermokarsts. So permafrost had been thawing already in this area. And we're just real curious to see how these past few years of intense fire maybe contributes to thermokarst or thaw area on this landscape. I think we just need to keep monitoring this over time. But this is a really, I call it a carbon surprise, because we are actually able to see the emissions coming from these Russian fires. I think we're on the order of like the Scotland energy usage over the same time frame. So, these are national level carbon emissions occurring because of a fairly large region, but still a regional disturbance regime. So just 2 quick conclusion slides, and then I'm happy to take any questions. I'm just continuously fascinated by this concept of legacy and how northern ecosystems have really been shaped by these legacies, sometimes over centuries, sometimes over millennia. And I see tons of evidence, whether it's peat erosion and drying and zombie fires in the peat, or whether it's permafrost thaw. I think we're seeing an erosion of these legacies. And what that means is some of the models of resilience that we've worked out over decades of ecological studies, I just think we're in a new landscape, like a new era of understanding these ecosystems now. I don't think some of the resilience frameworks that we've relied on for ecological understanding are going to hold true in the future. And we're going to witness that, certainly in my career. And another message I wanted to leave you with is, we use the term gradual thaw and abrupt thaw, but they are just not the same thing. So abrupt thaw is not just speeding up the dial of gradual thaw. It leads to novel combinations of ecosystem expressions and new species on the landscape and new hydrologic pathways. It's its own beast. And so we need separate conceptual models and actual, process-based models to deal with these abrupt changes independently of what we know about gradual thaw. They can't really be compared. They're not the same thing over a different time frame. And my final sort of concept to leave you with is one that really sits deep with me. And this is a word that I was taught taught long ago by a wonderful elder who brought us out onto the land, and we did a land exchange. And the word is sila. And I later learned that sila is often translated in English to mean weather. But I don't think that's a very accurate translation. And I think of it more in terms of connectedness. So sila is often used to represent connectedness to the environment, to the land, to the water. And today, what I want to share with you is sila, in that we are also connected through our shared atmosphere. So the Arctic is changing faster than anywhere else on the planet, 4 times faster than anywhere else on the planet in terms of warming. And what is going on in the Arctic is going to turn around and affect all of our climate through our shared atmosphere, through our sila. And Northerners know that. They know they are stewards of the land, and that includes the carbon in permafrost. And they want to be stewards of the atmosphere as well. So if we can all join together in this concept of sila and think about our shared atmosphere, but also a changing Arctic, I do think we can sort of rebuild our science society disconnect and come together, hopefully, to save what parts of the Arctic are left. So with that, I will thank you very much and happily take questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Merritt. That was a really great talk. It looks like we already have a question from Benjamin Johnson.
Hello, Doctor. I really liked what you were saying about the material legacies, and I guess my question is this: how much do you look to peatlands in lower latitudes when you're trying to look at the processes of things happening further and further north? Because, and I see Evan's also raising his hand. Evan is a fellow Minnesotan. But in Minnesota, I mean, we call it the Big Bog, but it's one of the largest intact peatlands, I guess, in the lower 48. But there is no permafrost under that landscape. And so I'm wondering, what can you take from these relatively southern landscapes that are peatlands, and how do you apply that to what you're looking at up north, I guess?
It's an awesome question. And I will just say, I got my start as a peatland ecologist working on a big latitudinal transect study that went from New York to Minnesota to Edmonton, and then further north into the southern Northwest Territories. And what we were trying to study as part of this we were trying to use this as a space for time substitution. And I will say, I think that work was really helpful, but it's a little bit more complicated than that, because there are different kinds of peat histories. And it's not just temperature that's changing along, or even moisture that's changing along those gradients. It's also things like nitrogen deposition, and all of those things, needed to be studied. What I'm really fascinated on, the big issue with permafrost carbon release is, we're not pretending that, permafrost carbon stores twice as much carbon as contained in the atmosphere. And most of that is actually going to stay in the ground. So our best predictions are about 15% of the permafrost carbon pool is probably vulnerable to rework, being released to the atmosphere. But that's a big assumption. And so I feel like studying some of these more older and decomposed peats further south might help us to test some of the temperature sensitivities on sort of peat permafrost that we need to know. So things like reciprocal transplant studies across some of these different settings might actually be really helpful to revisit. But no, I'm temperate and sort of what we call fringe boreal peatlands are a real passion of mine. There's some pretty fascinating topics, and also for diversity, right? For biodiversity issues and other hydrologic issues. So it's a great question.
Thank you.
We'll jump to Evan next, since I'm guessing his question is going to be on a similar thread.
Hi, Merritt. Great talk. I am really interested in this intersection between permafrost and fire regimes. And it seems like something that is going to change and that we don't have a lot of great, even great paleo examples of. But I guess my question was, you showed how much carbon was being emitted from the gradual and the abrupt peatland changes. And I was wondering how much of those emissions come from burning versus other ways of emission, and how, like, A, how that's parameterized in the model, and then B, whether or not what we've been seeing recently, like in Siberia with those huge burns, like whether that lines up with what we think from what we have been able to model.
Yeah, so really simple. I don't know of a single model, even a small scale model, that has really looked at fire and thaw interactions for carbon release well. And I'm actually working with a group at Woodwell right now to try to implement a couple of submodels that bring fire behavior and thaw together, but it's not easy. So in the work that I showed, there was no fire component to that. We kind of turned the fire off in the large scale models. And then I didn't I didn't specifically address fire in the abrupt thaw model, but of course, fire is always a trigger of permafrost thaws. So as we were amalgamating and synthesizing data from the literature, we didn't discriminate about whether that thaw feature was created by fire or any other mechanism. So fire is kind of mixed in, but we didn't call it out specifically. Yeah, I guess 5 or 6 years ago, I would have said, I think fire is going to spell bad news for permafrost thaw. I'm not so sure it's that simple anymore. Sometimes we need fire to rejuvenate a permafrost ecosystem. You know, not all fire is bad fire. And what we're seeing in some of our field work, maybe not in the Arctic, I mean, certainly not in such a sensitive area as what we're seeing, you know, in Siberia, but in the places where I work in North America, there's actually a ton of resilience post-fire in terms of how that permafrost is responding. And then we see a flourish of productivity at the site and a lot of peat accumulation. So I'm kind of fascinated. We're going to use this new thaw and fire submodel to kind of play around with. I like to use, I'm not a modeler, as you can tell. So I like to use models to play. And I think that's how we're going to use this new submodel, is to just kind of poke at that system a little bit. But I should say, when you get the crazy intense fires like in Siberia, or any aspect of overwintering fires, that's a whole nother ballgame. So those are very unusual sets of fire behaviors that, I mean, we're starting to see them more and more on the landscape. And I think that clearly is not going to be good for permafrost, because that is actually, you know, really consuming quite a lot of that soil organic matter. But just like a typical fire, I mean, that may not necessarily thaw the permafrost. It may actually do good for thermal regimes of the soil. So I think it'll be a fascinating area.
Yeah. A question I have from that is, so if you have permafrost thaw emitting carbon, but then if you have regrowth that's like taking carbon back in, is that in models currently at all, or?
Yes.
To what extent?
So we built that into our abrupt thaw model, and it is also in, for example, that McGuire model intercomparison, or MIP study. Whether it's done well, so there's a little bit of rumbling, you know, that maybe some of the large scale models are a little bit too sensitive to CO2 fertilization for northern productivity, because some of the productivity levels being shown by some of these models like remind me of the tropics, and I don't think we're going to see the northern, you know, taiga turn into a tropical level of productivity. So I do think some of these issues about vegetation sensitivity to other aspects of environmental change need to be further examined, but they are in the model.
Thank you so much.
So we've got a question in the chat from Brad Pierce. It's a two-part question. So when you refer to remote sensing, do you use ground penetrating radar? If so, how? And second, can you see local methane enhancements from satellites like Tropomi associated with rapid thaws?
Oh, such good questions. Okay, so the first question, so I do not, but there's a wonderful team here at the National Snow and Ice Data Center that I think are really sort of pushing the limits on how we're using ground penetrating radar to detect big scale active layer thickness. And so we're certainly donating our field data to that cause. When I use remote sensing, again, I'm an ecologist. I'm not even a permafrost scientist. I look for changes in surface expression that I know are triggered by permafrost thaw. So I'm looking for changes in lake area and changes in wetland thermokarst area. So that's the kind of change detection studies I tend to use. But in our synthesis and modeling study, we also incorporated remote sensing that looked at head wall slumping in the more gullies and thaw slump areas, for example, in the Peat Plateau area. Again, these are things you can see from space that tell us how those thermokarst areas are expanding. When you actually need to peer down into the permafrost to look at change, like and go subsurface, that's a whole different beast. And we really do need new technologies to be able to look at that. All right, so the methane question is fascinating because I get pulled into debates about this on Twitter, like almost on a daily level. So, you know, there are new data. It's wonderful. Like Copernicus has made a lot of these methane remote sensing data very open to the public, and there are hotspots all over the Arctic. And people like to interpret them as the methane is burbling up from permafrost thaw, you know, the Arctic Ocean is on fire. And I just don't think we're interpreting those data properly yet. And so my understanding is that still a lot of hotspots of methane are coming from energy production sites in Russia, and that those methane blobs do move around and get picked up by the satellite image. This is not my area of expertise. Did I mention? I should mention that. But I don't think we're seeing any evidence of permafrost methane release coming from those sources of data yet. Can they be used? Maybe with some further, you know, validation, absolutely. But I don't think we're there yet. That is just my personal opinion.
All right, we've got a question from John. I think you're muted.
Thanks very much for an interesting talk. I must admit, I don't know much about these issues, but it did strike me that one of the things we hear about a lot at the high latitudes is temperature increase. And I'm not sure I've heard as much, because I don't read the literature on this field, I've heard much about Arctic precipitation changes. And so I'm wondering if not only precipitation type anomalies that are in the modern era, but also amounts might have something to do not only with thawing, but destabilizing some of the permafrost. Is that an active area of research?
It is. And actually, I after I met with the grad student cluster today, just because a handful of students mentioned being interested in precipitation change, I was like, oh, I almost was tempted to go and change my talk, but I never changed my talk the day of the seminar. But we do work on precipitation changes and how it is affecting permafrost vulnerability. And I guess I would say, you know, what we're seeing in places where I work in interior Alaska is absolutely a shift towards a rainier Alaska. And depending on the time frame, so we're seeing some of that rainfall come down in times like April and May, where there used to be a thick snow cover. And now we've got rainwater percolating down into the peat and on top of the permafrost. And that rainwater is warmer than the ground surface. And so spring rain is kind of wrecking havoc on our permafrost right now. And we've just been able to amalgamate, I think Tom Douglas at Krell and I put together like 15,000 frost probe measurements over 5 or 6 years. And we were able to correlate rates of thaw with spring rainfall.
Wow, interesting.
And then there's all sorts of crazy connectiveness in the wetland hydrology, because oftentimes we see, you know, a lot of rainfall in higher mountains coming down through these regional flow paths and coming up into our wetlands. And that is also kind of changing the permafrost regime in the lowland areas. So yes, And, that's got a big effect on the fire regime as well.
Yeah.
So it's kind of coming all together, right?
Thanks very much.
So we've got one final question in the chat, and then unfortunately, due to time constraints, I think we'll have to say our goodbyes. But this one's from Susan, who says, "Thank you for the excellent talk. Is permafrost thaw included in models such as the NCAR Earth System model?"
So yes. And, if anybody's really interested in this model intercomparison study, I actually was not part of that, but it is a permafrost carbon network product, and I'd be happy to send a reprint to anyone who's interested. And so that really did bring the suite of what I call permafrost enabled models together. And NCAR is really leading. They're doing, I guess I would say they're thinking about permafrost complexity more than I've seen in some other groups. And I think if anybody's got a handle on trying to bring some abrupt thaw issues in, it might be in that model, but we'll see. But I guess I'll just say from that MIP, my impression is, and the models don't necessarily agree with one another. And what was so fascinating about that study is they were able to trace back why don't they agree? And one of the most fundamental drivers of variation in permafrost carbon responses from model to model is that they don't start with the same permafrost area in the world. So something as simple as like, well, how much permafrost is out there? There's like an order of magnitude difference between some of these models, which kind of just gives a little insight into the challenges that we have left to face.
Awesome. Thanks so much. It was wonderful to hear from you today and to meet you, and can give you one final round of virtual applause.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation, and please feel free to reach out with any lingering questions.